why don't you start, Jennifer? Malcontents, you're going to like this because Jennifer and I are not coming down on the same side of this story.
No, and I think, but we're not too divergent from each other. And I think what's particularly interesting is that we were having this kind of shift, especially in the last couple of decades, about, um, you know, mascots that either culturally appropriate or claim to represent Native peoples. Cherokee, I mean, Jeep has made an enormous amount of money off the Cherokee name. And so I think it's at least something that should be discussed in the context of royalties, because Native peoples historically, because of geographical isolation, because of ongoing oppression and dispossession, up until about the mid 20th century, have been really economically oppressed. And it's not until you see this kind of economic development initiatives that come out, especially when Johnson is president and the war on poverty, where Native people start to get some opportunities economically. I mean, you do have some outliers like the Navajo Nation and uranium mining things, but these are things that were not necessarily safe or good for the community. So for these companies to come in, appropriate the Cherokee name, make millions and billions of dollars off it, and for Cherokee peoples to not get anything from that is inherently wrong. But it just goes to the fact that these are independent, sovereign nations, and they, as such, have a right to weigh in on who uses their name and for what purpose. And I think that we really need to take that into consideration. But also it raises interesting questions about the federal recognition process, because the Cherokee are considered an independent sovereign nation because they are federally recognized. You have, for example, the Duwamish Nation, who isn't recognized as a nation because they don't have federal recognition, even though by all rights, they are an actual Native nation. So I think this story raises multiple big and interesting questions. And I know that you have a different perspective, David, on it. And so I will stop rambling and let you carry on.
Yeah, we're not that far apart. The name Cherokee has been around for 45 years. It was definitely a different time when the name was applied on the vehicle, it's been used in different ways. The name was retired. I actually didn't realize that in digging some information up on this story. And Jeep retired the Cherokee name in favor of the Liberty. And then in 2013, and I had mentioned this earlier, the name was revived, the Grand Cherokee. And the Grand Cherokee actually was a problematic vehicle at launch and controversial, which is a whole separate from this story. New York Times asked leadership in the Cherokee Nation at the time what they felt about it, and their feeling on it was ambivalent. Of course, a lot has changed from 2013 to 2021, and we have seen changes like Washington Redskins, the Cleveland Indians. Seahawks changed their logo, I think, right around that time. Like in 2012, 2013, where we started to see some shift in there. Some Seahawks fan I know is going to put in the comments over here, like date, time, etc. My view on this is moving forward, if the parent company for Jeep, and that's the other thing that complicates the story, is Jeep isn't even an American company anymore. It's technically a French company now. And if the parent company of Jeep were to do something in collaboration with the blessing of the Cherokee Nation, similar to what the Seminoles are doing with their name used by the Florida Seminoles, and to your point, Jennifer, they start getting royalties and payment, then I think that this is a fair and equitable solution. Another thing right off the top of my bat that Chrysler could do is like on the Grand, they could bring back the Liberty name, because obviously at some point, executives at FCA, that was the parent company at the time, decided to put the Cherokee name to pasture. Yeah. So it's really interesting to me because I don't think that purists of the brand can go, but the name is so important. It's like, well, if the name is so important, why did they retire the name for almost a decade, right? Yeah. But on the flip side, right, if I go to the other side of the argument, I go, they were asked in 2013 when the name was revived, and they said pass. So
Okay.
it's complicated, but at the end of the day, the First Nation should be respected, and the name should either be dropped or they should be getting compensation for the name going forward.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting. And, if you think about it, like the Cherokee Nation has had several principal chiefs, elected principal chiefs since the early 1970s. And Wilma Killer, who was like the first female principal chief, and she served from 1985 to 1995, she was very outspoken about this notion of mascots and things. But the Cherokee Nation is really interesting because where they're located, they're in Oklahoma. They tend to, some of them actually tend to be fairly conservative leaning. So you never kind of know if they're going. But yeah, it's definitely something that, people need to take more seriously. This is not the first time that people from the Cherokee Nation, principal chiefs especially, have spoken out about the use of the Cherokee name or mascots more broadly. So the fact that they were quiet about this at one point when they were asked about it in 2013 isn't necessarily representative of the longer kind of feelings about the use of Native mascots or their name in the Cherokee Nation in the 20th century.
So we had a comment from our New Zealand audience who says that they never use the Liberty name in New Zealand. They continue to use the Cherokee name the whole time there.
And that's interesting to me too, because, there's a huge indigenous population in New Zealand. And, I think we've kind of like shared stories or maybe reported a little bit on stories about this kind of, that there's still some ongoing, I guess I hate to call it like there's issues with settler colonization in New Zealand, in Australia, and the ways in which the governments and the peoples interact with the indigenous populations there. But also, you talked about it being like the parent company being in France now, but it's really interesting because a lot of like Britain and France and some of these other countries, especially Germany, had a really big obsession with Native peoples in the United States, and oftentimes would come and pay like top dollar for what they consider to be like, Native sacred objects or these other kinds of, and put them in museums or keep them in their homes. And Germany especially was really, really bad about that. So this obsession with Native peoples and cultural appropriation and all this other stuff isn't specific to the United States, even though it fundamentally impacts Native peoples living within the United States. Other European countries have become obsessed with Native peoples in the United States too, and what they think is their culture.
Yeah, another thing that was interesting, right? It's to me, this is not like a black and white, no pun intended in that. Like, this is not like a cut and dry issue. It was interesting because I did do a trademark search just for giggles for global vehicle names, and there are only a couple of examples of automakers outside of the United States using the equivalent of First Nations or indigenous names in their vehicles. And then there were a couple of examples that I felt were a little bit graspy. Like one of the examples I used was the name Outback. And I'm like, but Outback isn't a First Nations name. That is just, it's a region in, right? It's a region in Australia. It's a very broad region in Australia. And so to me, that's like, that's a little squinty when you do that. Thunderbird was on the list too, and it's like, well, I don't know. Thunderbird is a defunct name, and I don't see Ford ever bringing it back at this point because it's associated to two-seater coupes, and two-seater coupes are essentially dead in the global market. But Thunderbird's another one because it's like, well, where does that fall? And I don't want to conflate any of this, but the name Cherokee and its continued use is starting to get pretty unique. Like Chevrolet used to have the Cheyenne. They don't make the Cheyenne, and they won't probably ever bring that name back. Not even as a trim level. They have all different names at this point. There were a bunch of other names that came up that also are defunct, including the Pontiac name. Pontiac was named after a chief or a First Nation, or both. I think it's both. And, Pontiac is a defunct brand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I know. It's very interesting to me how white people in particular get to these these names. And it's, I mean, I can go on about this for hours, but I know you've got your hands full with Yoda, and we can save this for like a discussion some other time.
Our just a Kiwi gal in New Zealand is saying there are also the issue of companies that trademark names. Here in New Zealand, there's an indigenous singer who can't use her own name in Germany because some company has trademarked her name.
Yep.
That's just gross.
It is gross. Absolutely disgusting.